Welcome to the deep dive. Ever wonder why we, act certain ways when other people are around? What are those invisible threads sort of connecting us, influencing our thoughts, our feelings, our actions? Well, that's pretty much the heart of social psychology, and that's what we're diving into today.
Yeah, we've gathered some key academic sources that really help unpack this field, what it is, what it covers, and its journey over time.
Right. And our mission here is simple. Give you the core insights. What is social psychology? What questions does it ask? And crucially, why does it matter for understanding, everyday life, not just some abstract theory?
Exactly. We want those aha moments for you without getting totally bogged down in jargon.
Think about, like a job interview. Why do candidates often end up dressing so similarly, even if they didn't plan it?
Or, on a much larger scale, consider the huge public response, the protests after the Nirbhaya incident, that collective action.
Right. These aren't random.
Not at all. Social psychology gives us tools, frameworks to understand the social forces behind these things.
Okay, so let's define it. At its core, what is social psychology?
Well, fundamentally, it's the scientific study. It looks at how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are shaped by other people. And just as important, how we influence others, all within social situations. That's a good working definition, like the one from Casson, Fain, and Marcus.
So it's scientific. It's not just like people watching. There's a method.
Oh, absolutely. Gordon Allport, back in 1985, he described it as using scientific methods to understand how our thoughts, feelings, behaviors are influenced by the actual, imagined, or even the implied presence of others.
The implied presence. That's interesting. What does that mean exactly?
It suggests that even when we're alone, our awareness of others, of social norms, can still guide us. Like maybe you're writing an email and you think about how the recipient might react. Even though they're not there, that's the implied presence influencing you.
Okay. That internal editor, sort of shaped by social expectations, makes sense.
Exactly. And that scientific nature is key. It means systematic observation, careful description, precise measurement. Social psychologists use experiments, rigorous observation, things that can be replicated. It's about building reliable knowledge, not just intuition.
So evidence over gut feelings. Got it.
Precisely. And within that, there are three main goals: describing social behavior objectively, explaining why it happens, and trying to predict it in the future. This is what sets it apart from just, common sense ideas about people.
Describe, explain, predict. Okay. So what's the actual stuff it studies? What's the focus?
The focus is really on the individual. Their thoughts, we call that cognition in psychology, how we process social information, their feelings, and their actions, but always within a social context. So cognition covers how we make sense of people and situations. Feelings are the emotions involved, and behaviors are the observable actions: cooperating, arguing, helping, ignoring.
It's the interplay, then, between our inner world and the social world outside.
That's a great way to put it. And a really fundamental idea here is Kurt Lewin's model from 1936. He said behavior isn't just personality, and it isn't just the situation. It's the interaction between the person and their environment. B equals FPE. Behavior is a function of the person and the environment.
E equals FPE.
Think about it, someone usually quiet, right? Put them in charge of a project team, and suddenly they might become quite assertive.
Right. The environment changes their behavior, interacting with their personality.
Exactly. You need both pieces to understand what's going on.
That feels really foundational, this constant dance between who we are and where we are. So where does social psychology look? What's its scope? It sounds huge.
It is broad, but the common thread is always that individual within the social context, how individuals in society interact. So one major area is attitudes, how we form our evaluations, our beliefs, our feelings about things, people, ideas, objects, how attitudes are structured, how they change advertising, what purpose they serve, and importantly, the link between our attitudes and our actual behavior, which isn't always straightforward.
Right. What we believe versus what we do. Attitudes. Okay, what else?
Then there's social cognition. This is a really big area. It's about how we perceive, think about, and remember social information. It includes things like first impressions, person perception, how we figure out why people do things, that's attribution. Was it them or the situation? And a key concept here is schemas.
Schemas? Like mental shortcuts? Or blueprints?
Yeah, blueprints is a good way to think about it. They're organized patterns of thought about, anything social, types of people, events, roles. They help us process information quickly. Like you have a schema for a lecture, so you know roughly what to expect and how to behave.
Okay, so they help us navigate.
They do. But they can also lead to biases. If your schema for librarian includes quiet and stern, You might misjudge a very outgoing librarian based on that shortcut.
Ah, so helpful, but potentially misleading. Got it. What's next?
Social influence. This is all about how people affect each other's thoughts, feelings, and actions. It covers persuasion, conformity, going along with the group, and obedience to authority. Why do trends catch on? Why do people follow orders?
The ways we sway each other, basically, makes sense.
Exactly. Then we have pro-social and antisocial behavior. This tackles fundamental questions. Why do we help others? Why do we show affection? But also, why do we sometimes act with hostility, aggression, or prejudice? What makes us capable of both kindness and cruelty?
Yeah, the sort of Jekyll and Hyde aspect of human social life.
Kind of. And finally, there's the study of social groups and group dynamics. How groups form, their structures, how decisions get made within them, how being in a group affects individual behavior. Think about conformity pressures within a team, or how leaders emerge and influence the group.
Wow, okay. It really does touch on almost everything we do socially. Now, how did this field come about? It didn't just appear overnight, right? What's the history?
No, definitely not. Its roots go back to the late 19th, early 20th century. In the early years, some German scholars talked about Volcker psychology, kind of a collective mind idea. It didn't stick as a core concept, but it showed early interest in social context. Then, around 1908, you get the first books actually titled Social Psychology, one by McDougall in Britain, another by Ross in America. But they weren't quite modern texts. McDougall focused a lot on instincts, Ross on broader social forces.
So more philosophical or descriptive at that stage.
A bit, yeah. But around the same time, you see a crucial shift towards being more scientific. Wilhelm Wundt's first psych lab in 1879 emphasized controlled observation. And then behaviorism, with John Watson in 1913, pushed for focusing only on observable behavior. This influenced early social psychologists like Floyd Allport, who really advocated for experiments around 1924. And even earlier, you had studies like Triplets in 1898, looking at how cyclists performed better when racing against others versus just the clock. Early hints of social influence research.
Okay, so the seeds were planted. What about the formational years? When did it really take shape?
The 1940s and 50s were absolutely key. Kurt Lewin, often called the father of modern social psychology, really hammered home that interaction idea, B-S-A-K-E. He pushed for studying behavior in its dynamic context. And Leon Festinger in the 50s was a huge advocate for rigorous experiments, careful measurement. He even suggested sometimes needing to keep participants unaware of the real purpose of a study to get natural behavior.
The whole ethics debate around deception in research started around then.
It certainly became a major point of discussion. World War II was also a massive catalyst. It spurred research into persuasion, propaganda, prejudice, and led to some landmark studies. Think of Muzaffar Sharif and Solomon Asch on conformity, how easily people can be swayed by a group majority. Or Stanley Milgram's obedience studies how far people would go following orders from an authority figure. And Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment on social roles.
Yeah, those are the big ones everyone hears about. Powerful and unsettling.
Definitely. They provided profound, if sometimes disturbing, insights into social influence. Then came a period of expansion in the later 20th century. Researchers branched out. John Darley and Bibla Tanay studied the bystander effect, why people are less likely to help when others are present.
Right, the diffusion of responsibility idea.
Exactly. Leonard Berkowitz did important work on aggression. Irving Yanis looked at groupthink, how groups trying to agree can make terrible decisions. You might see that in meetings sometime.
Oh yeah, definitely, where no one wants to rock the boat.
Precisely. And work continued on intergroup relations prejudice, discrimination by people like Gordon Allport and Sharif again. Later in the century, there was a big focus on attitudes, how persuasion works cognitively, and Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory became really influential.
Dissonance, that feeling when our actions don't match our beliefs.
Yes, that uncomfortable feeling. Like if you believe smoking is bad, but you smoke, you feel dissonance. So you might change your behavior, or maybe, more likely, change your belief. Downplay the risks, perhaps.
Find ways to justify it. Okay.
And of course, the rise of computers and information tech opened new doors for studying social cognition, how we process all this social information.
So where's the field now in the 21st century?
It just keeps broadening. There's more focus on health, happiness, well-being, and how social factors play into those. Also, evolutionary perspectives, how might our social behaviors have roots in our evolutionary past? The role of culture is huge. And social neuroscience is booming, using brain imaging, like fMRI, to see what's happening in the brain during social interactions.
Wow, looking right into the brain. That's fascinating. Now, you mentioned India earlier. How did social psychology develop there?
Well, initially it was quite intertwined with sociology. The very first Indian book on the topic, back in 1928, was co-authored by a psychologist, N.N. Sengupta, and a sociologist, Rahakamal Mukherjee. But later, as Indian psychologists worked to establish psychology as its own scientific field, they often followed Western trends. Though there was some really interesting early work, like Jamuna Prasad's study in 1935 on rumors after the Bihar earthquake, it actually touched on ideas Festinger explored later about how people use social comparison to reduce uncertainty in ambiguous situations.
That's a cool connection. So connecting local events to broader theories.
Yeah. Later research focused on things like prejudice, stereotypes, attitudes, often using surveys. More recently, there's been a push towards understanding things like ethnic identity from more indigenous perspectives. Scholars like Ashish Nandy and Sudhir Kakar have done important work exploring how Indian culture shapes psychology.
Interesting. So it's both global and local. Now, social psychology clearly doesn't exist in a vacuum. How does it relate to other fields?
That's a really important point. It's distinct but deeply connected to other disciplines. Take anthropology, it studies cultures broadly. Social psychology looks at how those cultural norms influence individual behavior in specific situations. Or economics. It connects through ideas like social exchange theory relationships as cost-benefit analyses. Economics looks at big systems. Social psychology looks at individual choices within them. Political science studies voting, leadership. Social psychology offers insights into the psychological processes behind political attitudes and actions.
So they offer different zoom levels almost on human behavior.
Exactly. Sociology is a close cousin, both study groups and social behavior. But sociology often focuses more on large-scale structures and trends, while social psychology usually drills down to the individual within the group. But there's tons of overlap and exchange.
Okay, and within psychology itself?
Big connections. Biological psychology and neuroscience provide the biological underpinnings, brain activity, hormones. Clinical psychology focuses on mental illness, whereas social psychology focuses on typical functioning, but the fields inform each other. Social factors impact mental health, and psychological principles apply to therapy.
And thinking connects to cognitive psychology.
Absolutely. Cognitive psychology studies basic mental processes, memory, attention. Social psychology borrows heavily from it, especially for social cognition. How do we process information about people? That's a blend of both fields. Developmental psychology looks at change over the lifespan. Social psychology examines how social skills and attitudes develop from childhood onward. And personality psychology focuses on stable individual differences, our traits. Social psychology often emphasizes the situation's power, but increasingly the focus is on the interaction between personality and situation, which brings us back to Lewin.
It really seems like a hub discipline, connecting so many areas. Now, you mentioned different levels of analysis. Can you break that down? How do social psychologists look at behavior from different angles?
Sure. They often analyze social behavior at several different levels. At the most focused level, the individual, intrapersonal, they look inside the person's mind. This is where you study social cognition, attitudes, self-concept, maybe even why someone deviates from norms. It's about internal processes.
Okay, inside the individual. What's next?
Then you move up to interpersonal interactions. This is about what happens between two or more people. Communication, persuasion, cooperation, competition, helping, aggression, prejudice between individuals. It all falls under this level. Direct person-to-person stuff.
Right, the dynamics between people.
Then there's the interaction between the individual and the group. How does the group influence the person? Think conformity, socialization, learning, group rules. And also, how does the individual influence the group? Leadership, innovation, dissent. It works both ways.
The individual versus the collective, kind of?
Exactly. And the broadest level is interaction between groups. How would different groups relate? Are they cooperative? Hostile? What about stereotypes between groups? Intergroup conflict and how to resolve it. Think about company departments, sports teams, nations, any situation where group identity matters.
So it's like zooming from the microscope up to a wide-angle lens to get the full picture. Okay, so to tie this all together, what are the main theories or frameworks social psychologists use to explain all this?
Well, there are several major theoretical approaches, but two really stand out: learning theories and cognitive theories. Learning theories generally propose that our social behavior is learned through experience, just like other behaviors. One way is classical conditioning. Remember Pavlov's dogs. We learn to associate things. If you repeatedly have stressful experiences with a certain group, you might start feeling anxious just seeing someone from that group through association.
Learned emotional responses, okay.
Then there's reinforcement. Behaviors followed by rewards tend to be repeated. Behaviors followed by punishment tend to decrease. Skinner's work. A kid shares a toy, gets praised, shares more. A student contradicts a teacher, gets shut down, maybe doesn't do it again. Simple reward and punishment shaping behavior.
Consequences drive actions.
And the third learning mechanism is observational learning, linked strongly with Albert Bandura. We learn by watching others, our models. You see someone do something, see what happens to them, and learn from that. Imitation. We don't always need direct reinforcement ourselves.
Learning by watching. That makes sense for social stuff.
Definitely. And a specific theory rooted in learning principles is social exchange theory. It views relationships like economic exchanges. We try to maximize rewards like companionship, help, and minimize costs, effort, conflict. We weigh these up, compare them to alternatives, and that influences our relationship decisions.
Like a cost-benefit analysis for friendships or even jobs.
Exactly. Now, while learning theories are powerful, a criticism is that they sometimes downplay internal stuff, thoughts, creativity, pure altruism, making us seem a bit reactive.
Right, like we're just responding to rewards and punishments. So what about cognitive theories? How do they differ?
Cognitive theories put the emphasis squarely on our mental processes, perception, memory, judgment. They argue that how we interpret a situation is key. We're not just passively reacting, we're actively thinking, selecting information, making sense of it. Gestalt psychology was an early influence here, the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that we perceive patterns.
So the mind is actively constructing reality, not just recording it.
Precisely. Cognitive theories focus on cognitive structures, how our knowledge and beliefs are organized in our minds. And schemas, which we mentioned earlier, are central. Those mental frameworks help us organize info, fill in gaps, make inferences quickly. They guide how we process social information.
So schemas are key to the cognitive view.
Very much so. Another big idea is the principle of cognitive consistency. We like our thoughts and beliefs to be consistent, to align. When they clash like holding two contradictory ideas, it creates cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling we talked about. And we're motivated to reduce it, maybe by changing a belief or an attitude.
Right, aligning our thoughts to feel better.
Exactly. Cognitive theories have been huge for understanding things like self-concept, person perception, attitudes, stereotypes. The main limitation, perhaps, is that cognitive processes are internal, hard to observe directly, and maybe sometimes the theories oversimplify how complex our thinking really is.
Fascinating. These different lenses really offer complementary ways to look at why we do what we do socially. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways?
Well, I'd say the main things are: social psychology is a science. It systematically studies how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the social context. It recognizes the power of others, whether they're actually present or just implied. It's got a rich history, diverse methods, and key theoretical perspectives like learning and cognitive approaches. And it always focuses on the individual within that social world, looking at behavior from multiple levels.
And it's not just academic. Understanding this stuff really helps make sense of our own lives, right? Our interactions, group dynamics, even bigger social issues.
Absolutely. And maybe something for you to think about. Consider a recent social interaction you were in. Look at it through these lenses we discussed, the learning perspective versus the cognitive one. Which approach seems to better explain what happened, either your behavior or someone else's? What does that tell you about just how complex, how multi-layered our social lives really are? It's something to observe as you go about your day.